So, again, looking at State of New South Wales versus Kiskinen, preliminary, 2021, New South Wales Supreme Court 915, hearing date 21st July 2021, date of orders and decision date 27 July 2021, jurisdiction common law before Justice Julia Lonergan. So, in the last video, we went through Julia Lonergan's synopsis of the case made and the stance by the plaintiff. And this time, she highlighted quite a number of inconsistencies in the case, but this time we're going to delve into the defendant's perspective, and it's fascinating. This is the complete and utter breakdown, basically, of the position of the state of New South Wales, in particular the Fixated Persons Unit and Detective Senior Constable Matthew Reason. So, again, in the document, paragraph 74, the defendant. The defendant submitted that first, the statutory preconditions in the Act have not been met. Second, the court would not be satisfied to the necessary degree that the defendant poses an unacceptable risk of committing a serious terrorism offence, if not kept under supervision under the Act. It was also submitted that third, the court would not be satisfied that the matters alleged in the documentation would, if proved, justify making the ESO. 75. It is significant that the offending for which the defendant was sentenced under the Code was relatively low level, in that it was a simple offence of using a carriage service to menace, harass, or offend, rather than the type of offending in Chapter 5C of the Code, urging violence against the Constitution or against groups, or advocating terrorism. 76. Whilst the defendant's possession of an unregistered gel blaster was sufficient to qualify him as an eligible offender, the nature of the offences weighs strongly against the order being made. 77. There were submissions made about whether the service requirements under the Act had been met and whether there had been disclosure as required by the Act, but these matters were, in my view, faintly pressed, and the application was defended on the basis of the material being properly before the court. 78. What was pressed, however, appropriately in my view, was the problematic basis of the psychologist's risk assessment report relied upon by the plaintiff, purporting to calculate the likelihood of the defendant committing a serious terrorism offence. The report of misprints was heavily qualified, referring to itself as an, quote, interim assessment, end quote, only, and concluding that any risk presented by the defendant required a narrative shift occurring before any such activity would proceed, and it would be activity in which his role would likely be limited to promotion, recruitment, and development of material. It was in this context that she assessed the defendant as presenting a, quote, moderate to high risk, end quote, using the Violent Extremism Risk Assessment Tool, VERA. There was nothing in the report, however, that assessed the likelihood of the contextual change or narrative shift actually ever occurring, and so her conclusions remain speculative. 79. The defendant disputed that he should be correctly considered a, quote, convicted New South Wales terrorism activity offender, end quote, even under the extended definition set out in Section 10(1)(a) of the Act. 80. Section 11 of the Act sets out the matters the court may consider in determining whether the defendant is in fact a convicted New South Wales terrorism activity offender. 81. First, the sentencing magistrate specifically declined to sentence the defendant on the basis that he had an allegiance to a particular group. Second, evidence adduced on sentence did not, properly read, lead to a conclusion that he was either making a, quote, call to arms, end quote, to his associates to hang police, or engage in any act of violence. In fact, there was a number of statements that show an intention to act peacefully and that he expected others to act peacefully. Third, there is no relevant terrorism intelligence. The material in the affidavit of DSC Reason is not a report relating to terrorism or a terrorist organisation. It is full of speculation and opinion without real foundation as to what other unidentified people, quote, might do, end quote. Emphasis was also placed on the concluding paragraph of DSC Reason's affidavit that it should be read as a, quote, picture of a group that has effectively dissipated, with members being disillusioned and having moved on to different groups, end quote. 82. Fourth, there was nothing in the prior convictions relevant to terrorism or of sufficient seriousness to give any concern about the defendant having potential to commit a serious terrorism offence in the future. 83. Fifth, there was nothing in the risk assessment report of Miss Prince which could comprise an assessment result of relevance to, quote, terrorist behaviour, end quote. So this is a quote from the risk assessment report of Miss Prince. Quote 113. This must be paragraph 113 of the report. The notable difficulties in determining the specifics of Mr. Kiskonen's risk are further complicated by the limitations of the assessment. Having not been afforded the opportunity to involve Mr. Kiskonen in interview or assessment. Further, whilst the United Kingdom of Australia promotes and adopts the sovereign citizen style beliefs, their overt promotion for violence to achieve sovereignty is not clear. To the knowledge of the author, the United Kingdom of Australia has not been designated as a terrorist organisation. As such, whilst it is evident that Mr. Kiskonen has previously taken a leadership role in the group, whether his behaviour could constitute a serious terrorism offence is directly related to the fundamental intent of the broader group. If the United Kingdom of Australia was to be designated as a terrorist organisation, he would certainly present a threat regarding directing the activities of a terrorist organisation, S102.2, membership of a terrorist organisation, S102.3, recruiting for a terrorist organisation, S102.4, training involving a terrorist organisation, S102.5, getting funds to, for, or for a terrorist organisation, S102.6, providing support to a terrorist organisation, S102.7. Paragraph 114 of Ms. Prince's report. There is currently no information that suggests Mr. Kiskonen is or had previously made any preparation toward undertaking or directing others to undertake an act of violent extremism, politically motivated violence, or terrorism activity. However, his statements and promotion of the government officials as war criminals, foreign occupiers, and Australia currently being an occupied country, and therefore rules of war applying, are certainly significant expressions of concern. This is furthered by his making statements regarding holding the police, courts, government to account, using them as an example through military jurisdiction, military trials, and noting that some public servants deserve to be hanged and their necks snapped. He notes it would bring him pleasure, no satisfaction. His role as the face of the kingdom has him creating and promoting written documents, recruiting and encouraging others to take the oath, promoting the ideology and the imminence of needing to pick a side in order to be afforded protection, whilst he is not overtly or publicly calling for violence to overthrow the government, he does create, and as I see, environment and a narrative which would easily be interpreted as a call to arms. That's the end of the quote from Miss Prince's report. So back to 84. At its highest, the conclusions in these paragraphs amount to speculation that the environment or the narrative could change to be interpreted by others as a, quote, call to arms, end quote. There is nothing relevant to activity in custody and nothing that indicates information that any of the defendant's current or former associates are known to be included in terrorism activities. 85. In respect of Section 10(1)(c) of the Act, the defendant submitted that neither he nor the UKOA have advocated support for a terrorist act or violent extremism. Section 11 factors must be borne in mind, as must Section 100.1a and its interaction with Section 100.13 of the Code, that effectively excludes certain activities from the definition of, quote, terrorist acts, end quote. It's worth pausing on this one, I think, because it effectively excludes certain activities from the definition of terrorist acts. So, is this not stating on a Supreme Court document, on the record, that we are under UN jurisdiction, under international law? We are an occupied people. And so the defendant would appear to be vindicated by this statement, and his entire time in custody completely unjustified, and of course forced involuntary medical treatment, psychiatric treatment, was a war crime, violation of Rule 92 of mutilation or biological medical experiments under international humanitarian law. 86. There is no evidence that the defendant intended to cause physical harm to any person or endanger lives by his actions. The calling for the curial overthrow of the government does not amount to a, quote, terrorist act, end quote, or a calling for curial punishment. The court should view any statement that a person or class of persons will be punished in a particular way, even by capital punishment when the law is changed, is quintessentially political advocacy, no matter how offensive or uncomfortable those threatened by it might find it. So that's really underlying the conclusion in 85. Calling for curial overthrow of the government does not amount to a terrorist act, or calling for curial punishment. So so rapidly is the state's position completely falling apart here. And we appear to have an opportunity that is not understood by many, unfortunately. 87. The court could find that what the defendant is advocating is not conduct in support of violent actions, but rather application of what he believes might be the result of due process of law. And so it is, in effect, an extreme political view advocating political change as opposed to an extremist view advocating illegal violence. 88. The court should take at face value the videos and statements within them that are careful not to invoke extra-curial violence, but telling listeners to be careful of what he had seen to be the operation of law, once the matter was, quote, before the Hague, end quote. He also admonishes people who might attend that they must not be violent. In effect, what the defendant is advocating is for people to assert their rights. But if you are forced to, go peacefully and keep a diary of the interaction. 89. In respect of Section 10(1)(a), generally, the UKOA does not support, quote, terrorist acts, end quote, or, quote, violent extremism, end quote. It must be borne in mind that UKOA is not a declared terrorist organisation. The court should have real reservations about making a finding that the defendant's conduct meets the statutory threshold. So basically just saying what's glaringly obvious, that if the organisation that the defendant has advocated for or supported is not a terrorist organisation and cannot be labelled one, then it clearly hasn't met the statutory threshold for the making of an extended supervision order on the grounds that he is a terrorist threat. Obvious stuff. 90. Whilst the bar at preliminary hearing is a low one, there is still a requirement that the court is satisfied to a high degree of probability that the person poses an unacceptable risk of committing a serious terrorism offence, if not kept under supervision under the order. Section 24(7) of the Act requires the court to dismiss the application if the supporting documentation does not justify the making of an ESO. When the matters set out in Section 25(3) are considered, particularly noting the nature of the type of activity the defendant has actually engaged in, all there is comprises a generalized risk of making offensive YouTube videos and or speculation about what other people might do when they see such material. 91. It is important to note that the defendant would be subject to the parameters of a CTO to manage his mental health issues, which can be renewed as many times as necessary. As well, the Commonwealth Recognizance Release Order in place until March 2022. These items have the role of greatly curtailing any risk that the defendant will commit an offence. 92. The current information regarding the defendant is that he is no longer expressing adherence to UKOA philosophy. This should be seen as, at least, some evidence of decreased risk, regardless of the caution expressed by the treating specialists that he may be stating this to deflect scrutiny. 93. In respect of the CTO, it was emphasized that this is a coercive mechanism that overrides the defendant's personal autonomy in regard to treatment, including, if necessary, enforced medication, as well as potential changes to his liberty, such as being required to attend particular places at particular times to be examined. It also allows for medication to be given without consent and for further oversight by the MHRT. If there is a lack of cooperation with the requirements of the CTO, police can become involved to detain the defendant and take him to hospital for enforced treatment. 94. The Commonwealth recognizance was said to also provide a level of supervision in the community. It involves a referral to complete the EQUIPS foundational program to address generalized offending behavior, a referral to a psychologist for assessment and implementation of strategies to address, amongst other things, his mental health and ideologies associated with the UKOA. Referral to the, quote, proactive integrated support model, end quote, of Corrective Services New South Wales, as well as to the CSNSW Terrorism High Risk Offenders Unit for offence-specific intervention and to monitor his engagement with community corrections. These things would be more than sufficient to deal with any risk presented by the defendant. Just pause on that one. It's remarkable how many measures, how many departments are all in place already. The defendant's barrister here, in the words of or paraphrased by Julia Lonergan, is just arguing against the extended supervision order. His liberties have already been completely hampered in so many ways. 3, 2, 1. 95. The criminal history comprises relatively minor summary offences. A neighbourhood dispute should not be described as serious in the context of an application for orders based on the potential for terrorism. The presiding magistrate made positive comments regarding the hope that the defendant could return to his family and resume work. He took into account the defendant's mental health issues and tailored the sentence in a way that assisted the defendant to be provided with rehabilitation to be supervised by community corrections upon his release. Nothing was said by the magistrate suggesting that he thought the defendant was a terrorist risk. More of the same. 96. The plaintiff's submissions that the defendant's beliefs or commitments support potential engaging in terrorism activities are speculative and rely upon the speculative proposition that the defendant's mental health will deteriorate. This ought not to be the conclusion reached by the court given the CTO. 97. The risk the plaintiff argues is presented by the defendant is also premised on the need for a prior narrative shift to create perceived legitimacy for violence. There is simply no evidence as to when or how that narrative shift would occur, and so there really is no material upon which the court could find the circumstances that would underpin the reality of any risk presented by the defendant would occur, let alone it being considered to be an unacceptable risk. 98. The offensive material said to be material that advocates violence and amounts to a, quote, call to arms, end quote, to followers of the UKOA, seems to be a somewhat cynical submission, given that there has been no application by the state or police for the defendant's Facebook or YouTube material to be taken down, despite there being various ways this can be done. It just keeps breaking down. 99. In end result, what the plaintiff argues is not that the defendant intends to encourage or foster others to commit a terrorist act. There is no evidence that he holds or has ever held such an intention. The highest the plaintiff's case rises is that his videos might lead some people to commit terrorist acts. This has to remain an uncalculated, unevidenced, speculative risk which cannot, on any analysis, satisfy the court to a high degree of probability that the defendant poses an unacceptable risk of committing a serious terrorism offence if not kept under supervision under the order. 100. Even if the court thought the test was satisfied, the court should decline to make the order on discretionary grounds, given the role of the CTO and the Commonwealth recognizance that will both run to control any risk presented by the defendant. Section 25(3) Mandatory factors to consider. 101. Division 2.4 of the Act sets out the requirements for determination of an application for an ESO. Section 25(1) provides that the court can determine an application by making the order or dismissing the application. Paragraph 102. Critically, Section 25(2) provides that in determining whether or not to make an ESO, the safety of the community must be the paramount consideration of the Supreme Court. 103. Section 25(3) sets out the matters to which the court must have regard. At this preliminary hearing stage, some of the parameters have not yet been the subject of evidence. For example, there are no reports from persons appointed by the court to conduct psychiatric and/or psychological examinations of the offender. And most unfortunately, the risk assessment report by Ms. Prince, prepared in late June 2021, did not include any interface at all with the defendant. So revelation of his current stated thoughts and plans are limited to the 22 June 2021 review by Dr. White, set out in 48 of this judgment. To the extent that there is material available addressing these mandatory matters, I will refer to it at the level of detail I consider critical to my determination of this application. Given the very short turnaround time required of this judgment, not every aspect of all the 1,500 plus pages of material tendered can be the subject of reference or comment. Section 25(3)(b). Assessments of psychiatrists, psychologists, or medical practitioners as to the likelihood of the offender committing a serious terrorism offence and his cooperation with assessment. 105. Whilst it is clear that the court must take the evidence relied upon by the plaintiff at its highest, the report of Ms. Prince is heavily qualified. On more than 10 occasions within the report, she makes reference to the fact that she has not had an opportunity to engage with the defendant. And so in a number of respects, she declines to express a view about aspects of the potential risk that he presents. 106. The reason why the defendant was not made available to her to interview remains unexplained, despite my invitation to Mr. Emmett to explain why the defendant was not interviewed for the report. Well, that's damning, isn't it? They had 24/7 unfettered access to the defendant for months, and he was not made available. And an explanation was not given in court. 107. From the conclusions expressed in the, quote, executive summary, end quote, it is evident that Ms. Prince based her assessment on a file review only. But rather than simply allowing that fact to speak for itself, Ms. Prince goes on to say that her report, quote, should be considered an interim assessment only. Mr. K should be engaged in interview to allow for a more informed assessment of his current vulnerability, risk, profile, and protective factors. Emphasis added. End quote. 108. Ms. Prince concluded, quote, Mr. K is currently assessed as moderate to high risk for politically motivated violence, violent extremism, or terrorism activities using the VERA-2R. VERA was it's an assessment tool. I can't remember what it stood for. I'll find it. Violent Extremism Risk Assessment Tool. His role would likely be one of promotion, recruitment, and development of materials which promote the cause. When he would directly or indirectly promote the use of violence to achieve his goals is unclear. However, the emotive language and rhetoric is a genuine possibility to be interpreted as a call to arms. Mr. K's risk of grievance-fueled or targeted violence was assessed with the TRAP. I'm just going to pause for a second. This is so infuriating. All of these tools and processes. It's just quackery. It's pseudoscience, and it is shot down. We're reading how it's shot down on so many levels simultaneously. What did she just say? Interpreted. The emotive language and rhetoric is a genuine possibility to be interpreted as a call to arms. So one can be, through the use of all of these tools, these processes that seem to have no scientific backing, can be jailed, force medicated, because of the way their words may be interpreted, along with a narrative shift that could potentially lead to violent actions by others, despite the fact that the UKOA is not a terrorism organisation. There's no terrorist intelligence on it. The magistrate that heard his case didn't find him to be a terrorist risk whatsoever, and he had no history of mental health treatment before he was incarcerated. And then 10 days after, we have this convoluted, highly invasive, quote, treatment. This is staggering to me. Staggering they can so brazenly violate international law, and that people don't seem to see the significance of this, how clearly wrong it is. They're violating international conventions that have been in effect over 100 years in some cases. Everything that the defendant was asserting, to the best of my information, looking at this for hours and hours and hours, he's right. He is a prisoner of war, literally. Oh, it's amazing. So, where I was at, the detour, Miss 108, Miss Prince concluding, and we're quoting Miss Prince. Mr. K's risk of grievance-fueled or targeted violence was assessed with the TRAP-18. This assessment suggests that monitoring and active case management is warranted. This would be best achieved through the application of an extended supervision order with the joint management by the New South Wales High-Risk Terrorism Offenders Team and the Community Corrections Terrorism High-Risk Offenders. Details of recommended intervention and management strategies are outlined at the end of this report. End quote. 109. In terms of the risk assessment process, Ms. Prince noted that it is not scientifically possible to accurately predict whether or not an individual offender will or will not reoffend, and that the best that can be offered is an, quote, estimate that is anchored to empirical literature, specifying features associated with risk, and sound clinical analysis and formulation of how those present features might operate in the individual subject to the assessment. End quote. She explained that the process of risk assessment of violent extremism or politically motivated violence is, quote, comparatively new, end quote, when compared to the risk assessment for general violent and sexual offending behaviours. She explained that the assessment of risk of violent extremism, quote, cannot be anchored in statistical probabilities, and subsequently a numerical score cannot be provided. Rather, the overall risk judgment is based on the clinician's assessment of the available information at the time the assessment. End quote. 110. The VERA that Ms. Prince performed was completed on file information only. And again, Ms. Prince noted in that context, quote, it is recognised that this should be considered an interim assessment only, end quote. And again says, quote, should the opportunity to interview Mr. K avail itself, it is strongly recommended he be invited to participate in interview and assessment, end quote. She then goes on to state, based on the assessment of all the available information, that, quote, he is currently assessed as moderate to high risk regarding violent extremism, politically motivated violence, or terrorism activity, end quote. She makes this assessment without ever making any inquiry herself of the defendant as to whether any of the views in issue are currently held by him. 111. Ms. Prince stated, obviously based on the observations of others, that, quote, his actions thus far have demonstrated his ability to have a significant influence through both social media platforms and in real life. He has demonstrated a willingness and ability to recruit others to the cause. He has dedicated all his time outside of work on promoting and supporting the kingdom and detaching from his family. It has had a notable impact on his mental health and his liberty, with his being incarcerated for both a breach of his community corrections order and his index offences, end quote. And I'm just going to reiterate the statement at the start of 111. Ms. Prince stated, obviously based on the observations of others. (112) Ms. Prince concluded, without really explaining why, that there is a, quote, likelihood, end quote, that the defendant has maintained his belief in the cause and in, quote, Stephen, end quote. And so, quote, it is likely that should he be released without any active monitoring case management, he will likely resume his role, end quote. She added, again without explaining why, that, quote, whilst residing with his wife and the recognizance order may provide some level of protection in the immediacy, This is likely to have limited long-term effects. End quote. 113. Somewhat contradictorily, Ms. Prince says that this is paragraph 124 in Ms. Prince's report. The impact that Mr. K's incarceration has had on his worldviews is unknown. Whilst incarceration and medication appear to be a significant deterrent, whether he has the will or ability to cease all contact with the kingdom remains unknown at this time. This is likely further complicated by the potential for Mr. K's more recent experience through his contact with police, the courts, and the mental health services that may have potential to influence and increase in personal grievance, which aligns with the greater cause. End quote. 114. I consider the first part of paragraph 124 to be a reasonable reflection of the reality. That is, that it remains unknown whether the defendant has or will cease contact with, quote, the kingdom, end quote, or not. The second part of the paragraph amounts to nothing more than speculation. 115. With respect to the author, who was not given the opportunity to review and assess the defendant, the report contains much repetition of the comments of others, many assumptions, and much speculation. Even at this preliminary phase, and taken at its highest, the report carries little persuasive weight in assisting the court to resolve whether the defendant presents a relevant risk to committing a serious terrorism offence. Section 25(3)(d). Any report prepared by Corrective Services New South Wales or the New South Wales Police Force as to the extent to which the offender can reasonably and practicably be managed in the community. 116. The report of Mr. Bagley adds little to the question of risk, other than setting out and advocating his views as to how a defendant can be managed in the community and why he sees the multiplicity of proposed conditions to be necessary. The HRTO Unit Management Report of Detective Sergeant James is in the same category. Section 25(3)(g). Options, if any, available if the offender is in the community, whether or not under supervision, that might reduce the likelihood of him reoffending over time. 117. I accept the submissions of the defendant in respect of the potential role of the CTO in managing the risk of relevant offending. I consider the recognizance to have a lesser role, given it will expire in March 2022 and it cannot be renewed, but it has some role potentially in reducing the likelihood he will relevantly offend. Section 25(3)(h). The likelihood that the offender will comply with the obligations of an ESO. Section 25(3)(i). Previous compliance with obligations under parole conditions. Paragraph 118. The defendant failed to comply with his previous CCO. His failure was tied to his beliefs that were entrenched, it seems, at the time. It is hard to predict whether the defendant would comply with a proposed demanding combination of conditions proposed for the ISO and potential future ESO. He may, but the real question is whether there is a proper statutory basis to impose them. Section 25(3)(j). The offender's criminal history, including prior convictions and findings of guilt in respect of offences committed in New South Wales or elsewhere, and any pattern of offending behaviour disclosed by that history. 119. There is, in my view, no relevant previous pattern of criminal offending. I'm going to read that one again. There is, in my view, no relevant previous pattern of criminal offending. Section 25(3)(k). the views of the sentencing court at the time the sentence of imprisonment was imposed on the offender. 120. I agree with the submissions of the defendant that the defendant was not dealt with as a, quote, terrorism, end quote, offender, nor were the charges levelled against him framed as terrorist offences under the Code. Section 25(3)(L). Beliefs or commitments of the offender, whether of an ideological, religious, political, social, or other nature, that support engaging or participating in terrorism activities. 121. There is no doubt that in the past the defendant engaged in and professed beliefs of an ideological nature subscribed to by the UKOA. There is a lack of contemporaneous information as to whether he in fact still subscribes to these beliefs or not. It is at least possible that the ongoing treatment of his mental illness with medication has led to a recalibration of his delusions and previously fixed belief system. Imprisonment has also had a role. At the time of the assessment by Dr. White in June 2021, the defendant said he did not believe those things anymore. Dr. White reported no cynicism about that assertion, and there is no current evidence adduced by the plaintiff that demonstrates a contrary position. So, Justice Julia Line again. Am I satisfied to a high degree of probability that the offender poses an unacceptable risk of committing a serious terrorism offence if not kept under supervision under the order? 122. It seems to me that the requirements of Section 20A and B of the Act have been met. I entertain some doubt that Section 20C has been met, but I consider it just made out on a revisionary and reconstructed analysis. That because of some of the identified past activities of the defender, with hindsight, he could be viewed as a, quote, convicted New South Wales terrorism activity offender, end quote. 123. However, I do not accept that there is a high degree of probability that the defendant poses an unacceptable risk of committing a serious terrorism offence if not kept under the supervision under the order. 124. The evidence taken at its highest is equivocal as to where the defendant currently stands regarding his beliefs or otherwise in the doctrines of the UKOA. 125. There are multiple layers of speculation involved in the material upon which the plaintiff relies to reach the proposed conclusion as to the defendant's relevant risk. 126. I also doubt that the type of activities the defendant might engage in, even if he was still a, quote, believer, end quote, would, properly considered, amount to a, quote, serious terrorism offence, end quote. So that one really says it all. I also doubt that the type of activities the defendant might engage in, even if he was still a believer, would, properly considered, amount to a serious terrorism offence. 127. Fundamentally, however, I dismiss the plaintiff's amended summons because I am not satisfied to the requisite high degree of probability about the risk the defendant poses, and I cannot conclude that he presents an, quote, unacceptable risk, end quote, of committing a serious terrorism offence if not kept under supervision under the proposed ISO or ESO. Orders. 128. I make the following orders. 1. Amended summons dismissed. 2. Plaintiff to pay the defendant's costs. So in conclusion, I draw that particularly regarding paragraphs 86 and 87, 86, there's no evidence that the defendant intended to cause physical harm to any person or endanger lives by his actions. The calling for the curial overthrow of the government does not amount to a terrorist act or a calling for curial punishment. The court should view any statement that a person or class of persons will be punished in a particular way, even by capital punishment when the law is changed, is quintessentially political advocacy, no matter how offensive or uncomfortable those threatened by it might find it. 87. The court could find that what the defendant is advocating is not conduct in support of violent actions, but rather application of what he believes might be the result of due process of law, and so it is in effect an extreme political view advocating political change, as opposed to an extremist view advocating illegal violence. I think we have it on the court record very clearly that the justice did not want to say that this could be a terrorist. And if we think about the United Kingdom of Australia, and the flag behind you are in this video, existed before the administration that's currently in power. How can you define as terrorists the people that you occupy? Just that designation, I suspect, would be a war crime. Certainly if they're non-violent, as Ewa was. And then I thought that paragraph 126 reiterated this. I also doubt that the type of activities the defendant might engage in, even if he was still a believer, would, properly considered, amount to a serious terrorism offence. What Justice Julia Lonergan, I think, is put on the record for us to use, if we see the opportunity, is that she cannot state that a people rising up to call out war crimes are terrorists. This is why I've made lots of videos about the 1901 Federal Red Ensign that you see behind you are. That what this case shows us is that our law, you are standing, and the state of New South Wales got obliterated. This is a joke. The problem we have is that people can't see the full picture here. It, I don't think really is that complicated. But yeah, we don't pay attention long enough to really see it and put in perspective. The United Kingdom of Australia is the people of Australia, if they know their standing. And they cannot, at law, designate the people of Australia, the occupied, as a terrorist organisation, particularly when they're not calling for any violence. They're just trying to re-establish law. So we have on record breaches of international convention. We have the fraud of the psychiatric, psychological, mental health arm of the corrections service, and the fixation of the fixated persons unit, and how all of these parties work in tandem with one another to reconstruct on a revisionary basis the history, to silence, to destroy somebody that is a threat to them. Not because this man threatened them, he made predictions. But why is he taken out and not so many others that are calling for the same things? I posit that he was made an example of specifically because he had standing and he knew it.